everyone. I hope you can hear me, and welcome to, I don't know how many events we've been doing now in the Galloway Glens Natural Sciences series. Tonight's event is on the Willow Tit and the habitat they live in. What is quite maybe a sad fact, it's quite possible we'll have more people in this meeting tonight than we actually have Willow Tits in Scotland. So maybe we should bear that in mind. But we'll start off with Andrew and Crystal shortly. But before we move on to them, to remind you, we've got another event in a couple of weeks' time, which is called How Clean Is Your Screen? And that's looking at the invertebrate decline. If everyone remembers driving around the countryside in the days we could drive around the countryside, and we used to have lots of screen wash to clean the insects off our screens in the summer months. Now we don't need so much, partly because of the aerodynamics of cars, but also because there's been a massive decline in insect abundance, something which is extremely concerning for the future. So join us with Bug Life in 2 weeks' time. We'll be discussing the problem, also discussing some of the solutions, in particular a project called Beelines, which is going to connect up invertebrate communities across the southern Scotland. So without any further ado, though, I just remind you that, as ever, please ask your questions in the chat function. We have a couple of experts in the chat room. In particular, we've got Gavin Chambers from the RSPB, who will be helping to answer questions in there. And we'll also be picking a few questions in between the presentations and at the end. If you could all stay muted during the presentations, it stops any interruption of the speakers. So we're going to start the meeting now with Andrew Balinski. Now, Andrew Balinski will be doing a presentation talking about the biology of the willow tit and why should we care about it. Andrew's had 30 plus 40 years in the field of conservation, starting in the Wildlife Trust before moving to Scottish Natural Heritage, and then in the past decade or so has been working for the RSPB. So Andrew, if you'd like to share your screen.
Right, thank you very much. So hopefully I'm going to talk a bit about willow tits in general, and then my colleague Crystal will talk specifically about some of the work we're doing at Kendy Marshes and elsewhere to safeguard willow tits. So what is a willow tit? I should also say I appreciate there are quite a few folk in the audience that I've already spotted who potentially know more about these birds than I do, but we'll see what awkward questions crop up. The pictures are a mixture of things I've culled from the internet and some of my own pictures and some RSPB images. So as I say, they're a mixture. So I hope you can all hear me okay, first of all. So in the UK, we have 8 species of birds that are generally called tits, and there's a picture of them there. However, they don't all belong to the same family. There are actually 3 different families of tits and 4 different genera. So we've got Panurus, which is the bearded tit, which isn't really a true tit. We've got the long-tailed tit, which is a Lophophonus. We've got Parus, which is the usual, the blue tit, great tit, coal tit and crested tit are all Parus. And then a new generic name, Poaceal, which is the willow tit and the marsh tit in our particular country. And in that particular genus, there are 15 species. So when you think about small black-capped tits in America, for example, they're all chickadees. So the chickadees are part of the Poaceal genus, along with things like the somber tit and the Siberian tit. Oh, let me go back away. So there are a number of species that look not dissimilar to a willow tit, and one of them would be the coal tit. This is a coal tit, very familiar bird in our gardens, but readily distinguishable from a willow tit with those white wing bars, and it's a smaller bird, and it's got a very distinctive call, which again is different. So there we have the call of the song of the coal tit. So willow tits. Up until around 1897, there was thought to be just one of these tits in the UK, and that was the marsh tit. And it wasn't until 1897 when a guy called Otto Kleinschmidt did some work on bird skins in the British Museum. And he then differentiated between willow tits and marsh tits. And in fact, the subspecies of willow tit that we have in the UK now bears his name. So, as I say, the Latin names change. This bird, the willow tit, is Poecile montanus, and it was up until not that long ago was thought to be in the genus Parus. So it was Parus montanus. The Poecile name of the genus comes from the Greek poikilos, which means colourful or many-coloured, which I think is a bit of a misnomer for what is quite it's an attractive wee bird, but it's quite a plain bird. And also, the genus names, Parus is a masculine genus name, and Poecile is a feminine genus name. And so an ornithologist called Andrew Harrop argued in a British Birds paper in, I think, 2011 or thereabouts, that actually the specific name of the species should change as well. And so Montanus, which is a masculine derivative, should go to Montana to match the gender change, if you like, in the generic name. What some people get up to in their spare time beggars belief sometimes, but there you go. It was a very learned paper and a very well thought through paper. So, but it hasn't resulted in a name specific name change. So let's have a look at these two species first of all, the willow tit and the marsh tit. I need to get rid of that thumbnail view. These slides hopefully show the differences, the key differences between the two species. So you can see there that the willow tit has, sorry, I've got problems here with, that's better. The willow tit, the key differentiation really is the pale bar on the wing, the panel on the wing, which you can see here. Whereas the marsh tit doesn't really generally show this panel. It can do, but other differences are very, very small. You've got the willow tit here with the plain black upper mandible. The marsh tit has a little bit of white on the base of the mandible, but you've got to get pretty close up to the bird to see that. There are differences between the bib color. The bib tends to be a bit cleaner cut on the willow tit and slightly larger on the willow tit, I should say, and a small neat bib on the marsh tit, and different glossy black cap compared to a dull black cap. Very, very subtle differences, and even in the hand, it can be quite difficult to separate these birds, but certainly in the field, they can be quite tricky where you get them together. And one of the other key characteristics is that the willow tit is sort of more bull-headed and bull-necked than the marsh tit. But fortunately, I guess for us, certainly in Dumfries and Galloway, is that we only have the one species. And you can see from these two slides here, the willow tit does occur in Dumfries and Galloway, but the marsh tit is absent from most of Scotland, you get a tiny population creeping in over the borders and just over into the extreme southern tip of Dumfriesshire. But by and large, the two birds don't overlap in Scotland. So it's easy enough. If you've got a bird that looks like a willow or a marsh tit, it's going to be a willow tit in this neck of the woods anyway. The appearance is not the only thing that causes confusion between the birds. So the names themselves as well are a little, don't really describe where they appear. So marsh tits tend to prefer large, broad-leaved woodlands, whereas willow tits tend to be nearer water and in trees around water and copses and old sort of farm hedges, so that the habitat tends to be different as well. But the key difference and the really easy way to tell them apart is by listening to the song. So the willow tit here, this is the willow tit song, quite a plain note, pew, 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 or whilst the marsh tit is quite different. I hope you can hear. Oh, what's happened there? Sorry. The calls are also quite different. This is the alarm call of the willow tit. And this is the marsh tit for comparison. So a little bit about the biology of the willow tit. So this is a species that actually excavates its own nesting cavity, and that's done by the female, generally in a dead tree or a stump, birch being the favored tree to go for, generally lined with wood fibers, hair and feathers. You can see this is a female coming out with some material that she's bringing out of the nest hole. And they can nest in surprisingly slender trunks as well. So as I'm sure Crystal will talk about the sort of the size of trees and that we're looking for to manage. So youngish birch trees rather, where they're rotting, can be used. They will use nest boxes, and we've put nest boxes up on some of the reserves in Dumfries and Galloway, but they really need to be filled with wood chippings so that the birds actually got something to excavate. They generally lay eggs April to May time, 5 to 13, generally. And they're generally white with sort of reddish brown speckles on them. The female incubates herself, but then when the chicks hatch, they're fed by both parents. And that's a little brood of willow tits in a nest box, in fact, on a project down in the south of England. Incubation generally lasts for between 13 and 15 days, with fledgling 17 to 19 days after that. And they only have one clutch. They don't, if they fail, they tend not to try breeding again. The adults have got something like a 3-year lifespan. And again, they're generally monogamous. So that pair might stay together for a number of years. And also they stay together as a pair all year round as well. Now, this is the type of habitat that they like. very wet woodland here. This is, for those of you that know Kendy Marshes, this is the path just next to the path along to the original hide, the old hide at Kendy, and this is where the ground's become quite flooded, and you can see the very old trees growing there. Again, at Kenmure Homes, a mixture of willow in the main, in that part of the reserve, with water very close by. And also at the Wood of Cree, we have a good willow tit population, and they're in. This is on the standing on the otter platform, looking upriver, and that's the main reserve you can see. And it's these trees, the willows and the birches along the edge of the reed beds in that wetland area where the willow tits are predominantly nesting and holding territories. So why are we concerned? Well, the willow tit is the fastest declining resident bird in the UK. And it's second only, it's second only to the turtle dove in terms of the species that's fastest declining. The turtle dove obviously is a migrant bird. So in terms of resident birds, the willow tit is the fastest declining, and you can see there. This is an index of the decline of the bird. That you can see that graph from the early 70s, where there were upwards of 2,000 pairs, right down to that's the index rather, not the pairs. But you can see that it's dropped down, and the bird is on its way to extinction if things carry on the way they're going. They're obviously very constrained by the breeding habitat that they have. That sort of areas where you've got decaying standing timber. It's less widespread than it was previously. These areas tended to have been tidied up and cleared away and drained even. They're very sedentary species. They don't move very far. So recolonization can be very tricky from one area to another. So you can get a very localized population that's not spreading out. But we also think there are other factors in play. They have a very high adult mortality for one reason or another. There is competition for nest holes, and quite often, certainly where they overlap with marsh tits, quite often marsh tits will move in. They're a bit more aggressive. Then they'll boot the willow tit out of that excavated hole and take it over for themselves. And we've found the same with some of the nest boxes we've put up on our reserves, where we've got other hole nesting tits which are doing pretty well because we've put up nest boxes. And so you find things like coal tits and blue tits moving into willow tit boxes and kicking them out. So that is an issue which we're needing to address. And predation as well. They will get predated by things like great spotted woodpeckers and so on, that are, will get into the nest box or into the nesting cavity and take the chicks. So not only do they need this sort of the wet woodland, but it's also the structure of the woodland that's important as well. So they like woodlands with a sort of lower canopy cover, less of a canopy cover, but with a slightly higher cover in the sort of mid shrub layer, with the sort of species that are indicative of scrub and wet woodland. So things like hawthorn, elder, willow, and alder. Having that mix of species in the woodland is absolutely key for them. So Crystal's going to talk a wee bit about the National Willow Tit Survey, but I just thought I'd put up a couple of maps. So this is the coverage. This is a survey which should have been in its third year now. We've got 2 years of coverage, and you can see here, this is Dumfries and Galloway. So the the red squares are where willow tits have been recorded through the survey, and the blue squares are where they haven't been recorded, but have been in the past. So you can see again that there is there's something going on even in Dumfries and Galloway, which is a bit of a stronghold. Again, this is another part of Kenmure Homes, and you can just see the sort of mixture of habitat in there. And as I say, predation is a problem. So where we've got nest boxes up for other species, obviously the population of tits, coal tits and blue tits and great tits can benefit from our boxes, and so have an indirect or a direct impact on willow tits as well. When you joined, you heard at least part of the Tit Willow song from the Mikado, the Gilbert and Sullivan opera. So it does have a place in our culture as well. I mean, this is a depressing little song that Coco sings, where he meets a willow tit singing away and contemplating suicide because his partner has passed away. So they are very devoted to one another, the male and female willow tits. But more recently, this little booklet of poems by Steve Ely has been produced. And this was as a result of part of a project called Back from the Brink, which is a partnership project that RSPB and various county wildlife trusts and others, English Nature, south of the border, Natural England, I should say, south of the border have been involved with. And willow tits and willow tit conservation is one of the elements of the project. And this is a great little book. I bought it. It arrived last week. And so Steve has written various bits of poetry about willow tits in it. And I just thought I would, and just some prose as well. He's a birder. He's a birder from sort of the sort of South Yorkshire area. But he's written a poem called Dude, which those of you that know, a dude is a particular type of bird watcher. But part of the poem, and I'll just finish on this, which I thought was quite a good one. In the garden, I mean, caching seeds from the feeder in the planking of the fence, whole family in the cedars, pichu, pichu, zee, ta, ta, something like that. My lugs have been radged since 81, Motorhead, The Damned, and the Dickies supporting Evo Stick, Special Brew, amphetamine sulfate, move over for a damage case. I thought that's quite appropriate and apt for some of us that have maybe been to too many rock concerts in our time and are struggling to hear bird song and bird calls in the countryside these days. So thank you for listening. I will finish there and stop sharing. And if there are questions now, we might be able to answer some, or we could go straight on to Crystal's bit of the talk.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Really interesting. And we've got a number of questions that come out of it. Gavin and Crystal have been answering some of these questions throughout the presentation. There's one that occurred to me, but was quite interesting from Paul Connor, very apt for the time being, about climate change and has distribution already changed due to climate change? And also, maybe for myself, I was wondering, is the northern distribution in Dumfries and Galloway being its historical limit, or were they present further north? And is there an element of climate change where the species may move a bit further north if they've never been there?
I don't think it has ever been a terribly northern species. I think it's always been generally a southern species with this sort of, we're almost an outlying population as I understand it. And historically, there haven't been lots further north in Scotland. Others may put me right on that. Whether they're going to benefit from climate change or not is another matter. I mean, if climate change results in us having lots of wetter weather and therefore wetter woodlands, then yeah, we might get some. But I think that the fact they're declining all over the country probably suggests that climate change isn't necessarily the main driver for population change. But I mean, that's part of the work that's going on to address the decline of the species.
Another question's come in to PM to me by Bernard Saunders, and it's really related to the introductions of beavers and whether or not the habitat that beavers create, they're amazing biological engineers, would that end up creating potentially more willow tit habitat?
It could well do, and it would be nice to think so. I mean, clearly, beavers, when they re-engineer areas, create wetlands and attract, which in turn, attract lots of insects. Willow tits are insect feeders, so from that point of view, there would be lots of food around, and I suspect that there could well be habitat created.
Okay. Well, we're going to move on now, and what we'll do is keep throwing the questions in, because we'll have a little catch-all question and answer session right at the end of the evening, and Andrew may answer a few questions in the chat whilst Crystal's chatting. I see Crystal's already answered a few in there. So next we're going to move over to Crystal Moore, who is working with the RSPB on the reserves. So Crystal Moore has been working for the RSPB for a number of years, but prior to that, she volunteered for the RSPB, working on things like corn crate projects, etc. Started with the RSPB in the Western Isles and has been in the Galloway Reserves since 2002. And Crystal has been working on habitat work within the willow tit population. Crystal, are you ready to share your screen?
I am. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about what we're doing on RSPB sites. I'm going to focus on the bits I know, mainly the local areas to the Galloway Glens, which are the Wood of Key Reserve, Kenmure Homes and Kendy Marshes around Loch Ken. The Wood of Cree's just above Newton Stewart. And there's plenty of amazing work going on in other places, particularly in Yorkshire and the West Midlands and in North Wales. So there's not enough time to talk about all those projects going on and all the work going on. So hence me focusing on what I'm doing now. So next slide. So we do our most fundamental work we do, what we can do, is survey work, monitoring work and research projects. So in order to help the plight of the willow tit, we have to understand them, their behaviour, their population trends, their needs, and this is done through all this survey work and research that we do. So I shall talk, I'll give you a quick example of what we do annually on our to monitor our reserve populations. I was going to also say that some of those other projects, they do more than just monitor. They manipulate habitat to find out what willow tit prefer. Some even colouring or radio track individual birds to really hone into how they interact within pairs and between different territories. So there's a lot of work going on there, but on a year-to-year basis, this is what we do. So we pick a reserve. So in this case, I'm going to talk about Kendy Marshes. I'm going to make map a route through all the suitable willow tit habitat, which, as Andrew has said, is kind of wet woodland, low scrub, not much of a large canopy over top, somewhere where you have to wear wellies. So I've got that red line marking my suitable habitat through Kendy Marshes. I get all my survey equipment that I need, my bins, my map, my note making equipment, a GPS so I don't get lost, And in this particular survey we do, which is called a playback survey, we actually play the song and the call of a willow tit for 2 minutes along this track, every 100 meters along this route. You need a willing volunteer, surveyor, and finally, some really nice weather. So ideally for willow tit surveying, you need warm or mild weather in Scotland and no wind. So once all that's prepared, you mark out every 100 meters on your route and you walk to your first point. You do this twice between February and April. So on the first route, on the first time round, you go one way, and on your second time round, you go the opposite way. So you're not biasing the results by doing it at the same time by visiting the same part of the reserve at the same time of day. So I've started walking, I've got to my first point 100 meters in. We'd say 100 meters because your speaker is only going to probably at its maximum volume, only going to be heard by a willow tit about 50 meters away. So that's why you're stopping every 100 meters so they can hear you all over the site. So I've got to my point and I've settled down. This is a typical view I might get. And this is what I played for 2 minutes long. And if you're really lucky, by the way, a whole day of listening to that and you'll be listening to it in your sleep as well. You'll be dreaming about it. If you're lucky, you'll get a bird coming to you. So it's attracted by this call. It's probably quite an angry willow tit saying, "Why are you in my territory calling away? This is mine." So they'll kind of hang around you right above your head and they'll be angrily feeding and pecking at bits of lichen on a tree and kind of a bit curious looking at you. And then after you've turned off your playback, they lose interest pretty quickly and they fly away again. So you have to make, after you've done that, after they've dissipated, you make a note of how long it took for them to get to you, from which direction they came from, what kind of habitat they're in, how many you got responding to you, their behavior. Make a note of all these things and add them to your map. So a typical day might look like this. You're walking along and at your, what's that, 7th point, you get 2 birds responding to your playback call after 30 seconds. So you don't even have to play the whole 2 minutes for them. So you circle that point and you put in the male and female responded to your call and they came from the east. That's fine. They're in Birch Woodland, moving on. The next time you hear one and see one is actually not when you're playing playback. You just happen to be walking between your points, but that still counts. So you stick it on your map. You saw 1 bird feeding in Willow. Now you've got to make a mental note of where you saw that bird in comparison to where your next point is. Because you, lo and behold, after playing your playback, you get a bird at your next point, but it came from the direction that you heard the last one. And it's not that far away. It's only 50 meters away. So it's very likely to be the same bird in the same territory. Then the next one you hear is a few points away. So you don't hear any more after that. So I would surmise from this one visit that I've probably got 3 active territories in this area because one of them was a duplicate. One of the ones I heard was a duplicate. So it's a really easy, really simple survey to do. You can do it with no prior expertise in willow tit surveying. And if you're interested, there's a little summary of what you would do. There's still time to be involved this year. Unfortunately, the national survey was cancelled. The final year, as Andrew said, the final year was cancelled because of COVID. But you can still input data online or via a paper form to the BTO and RSPB to get that data, really important data in. So I would advise you don't go very far though, you stay within COVID rules, but you can still do it if you've got a local wet woodland. So all those blue dots on that map denote squares where you're likely to get good habitat for willow tit, but that haven't been surveyed yet during this national survey. So there's quite a few areas that are available for a quick little tootle round with your wellies, playing a bit of willow tit call. So that's my basic work I do every year on all those willow tit sites. The next thing we do is provide nest sites for willow tit. So sometimes, willow tits have very specific requirements. So the female doesn't become sexually active until after she's done a bit of nest excavation. So she needs to find a dead tree, rotting tree, that she's able to have a peck about in, or she's not even going to breed. So sometimes it takes a while to get the right tree as well. Sometimes you find stumps that have a series of holes or pecked areas, and the bird has found that the tree's too solid still, it's not rotted enough. So they'll spend, you know, the next 2 hours looking at the next tree, and then the next 2 hours looking at the next tree. So they spend a lot of time looking for the correct tree, and sometimes there's not enough available. So we come in there and help out. You'll see the picture on the right. The tree size is not that much bigger than the actual bird. They can nest in tiny weeny spaces. And as Andrew said, they have up to 13 young that they squeeze into a hole not much bigger than your fist. So it doesn't matter if you've got tiny trees in your woodland, you might potentially still have a tree that's big enough for a willow tit. Actually, they do also use normal nest boxes. That one on the left there is a normal nest box from Kendi Marshes. And sorry, I reused a picture that Andrew used as well on the right. Anyway, so although they can use normal nest boxes and find their own trees, sometimes there's just not enough to go around for all these birds to use. So we make these special ones that look like dead trees. So they've got a long front on the nest box. They're quite small inside. And most of the time we try and put like a natural looking front with the bark still on the timber to entice them even more and make it look like it's just a dying tree. Sometimes we don't always get that, but that's fine. As Andrew said, we fill them with wood shavings as well. So every single January, February time, we go around all our boxes and we fill them with wood shavings. And some people on some sites even block the holes because, so block them until kind of late February, March time to try and stop blue tits using them and other tits, anything but willow tit basically. But I don't think that's worked very well for us in the past up here, so we don't tend to do that. Other things we do is, instead of putting boxes up, we provide more rotten trees at the right height for willow tit. So we're doing a bit of felling at the moment at the Woodacree, and so on the left that's the Woodacree, and you'll see part of the felling we're just chopping the smaller trees off quite high to act as future willow tit nest sites. In the middle, you'll spot that in this woodland, which doesn't have much of the right species of tree, it's mostly oak and or very straight, kind of big birches, and it's not really got the right maturity and the right structure of and right size and species of woodland for nesting willow tit. So what you can do, you can cut a 2 meter length log and stick it to a tree. So that log that you choose is better if it's like a preferred species for willow tit, so alder, birch, willow, something like that. easily rotting wood, and you stick it next to a good tree that's going to stay there for a while, and willow tits might be enticed to use that. Also, if you're carrying out a bit of habitat management, like we do on those 3 sites I mentioned, if you're purposefully clearing scrub, you would leave some high stumps as well as part of that area that you're clearing. You wouldn't just clear the whole lot. You'd leave some high stumps in there as well. So that's the kind of thing we're doing. Coincidentally, we do have feeders up at Kendy Marshes near our boxes and our natural nest sites. And the willow tits do regularly come to the feeders. So that can help them get through those tough times, but also remember that you're feeding other tit species as well and other competition. So we don't put the feeders out specifically to feed the willow tits, but it just happens they go to them. And they're nice to look at for visitors, nice to see. And it's a handy place to record them if you want to get an idea of how many birds are about that area. It can be like a honeypot for them, so you can kind of count them easily. Right, onwards to a bit of habitat management that we're doing on the sites. So this is Kendy Marshes, and you'll see we try and keep a good diverse structure of woodland at Kendy Marshes. So we have kind of rotational cutting going on in the foreground, or the very edge of the woodland. You'll have the really young ones, medium age behind that, and then the tall ones at the back. So maybe that's easier to see. So the smallest ones will be about a year old, like kind of head height, just above head height. They'll be like 5 years old. And then the really mature ones, you know, they'll be 20 to 40 years old. And we just keep that structure by rotationally felling trees and allowing others to mature. We also keep the water levels high because you really want a wet area for willow tit. You don't want it drying out at all. And where you've got contradicting or potentially conflicting management requirements, it's quite an interesting issue to deal with. So this, for instance, is a picture of Kenmure Homes where we have some nice sedge meadows and fen habitat behind me, which is being encroached upon by scrub in front of me in the picture. So to protect the fen habitat, which is very important, we need to take out that scrub. But to allow habitat for willow tit to thrive, we need that scrub. So we need to make a balance. So what we would do here, we would fell some of these trees, but keep a nice little corridor or a series of stepping stones for willow tits. So I think I'll show you what I mean. So we take out trees and everywhere bar these 3 trees that this willow tit is skipping along to. So it may look quite drastic, taking out all those trees between them, but it's not long before they come up again, and you've allowed stepping stones for the willow tits to move around in to get to their other feeding areas. So it's all fine. So another example of that kind of rotational cutting we do, or we would do at the Wood of Cree, I'll give you an example here. So this is the River Cree, our Wood of Cree Reserve, and it's all the really nice habitat for willow tit is following basically the line of the river on the east side of it in this picture. And we do have willow tit territories along there, but the willow habitat, the willow car habitat is really similarly aged for miles. Like all along that corridor, it's all the same age. So it definitely needs a bit of diversification. So what we're planning to do over time, and this is, remember, this is going to take, this is going to be done on like a 5-year basis, little bits at a time, just taking chunks. So in the first 5 years, we'll maybe take out little chunks of willow here. Remember, we're going to be leaving the water level high, and we're going to be leaving high stumps to act as nest sites in these areas that we take all the willow out and other tree species that are there. And then the following 5 years, we might take these out. And then the next 5 years, we'll clear all that, and so on and so forth, until you've got like 40 years worth of trees taken out. And then once you've done that, you go back to the beginning again. And you just keep doing that forevermore until you've got this really diverse structure over 40 years, continually creating successional woodland. The other thing we do is we leave a lot of deadwood. So we're not very tidy with our woodlands, especially our wet woodlands on the reserves. We leave all the deadwood there in situ because we know that somewhere one of the old trees is going to become a really good nest site for a willow tit. And there's one there at Kenmure Homes. One more thing we're doing is plugging corridor gaps. So Andrew said that willow tit are very sedentary birds, and if their habitat becomes fragmented, they don't like crossing large areas to get to the next bit of good habitat. So you need to help them along a bit and join up all these fragmented habitats. So that's what we're doing at Wood of Cree, where in this little picture here, we're creating an extra 8 hectares of wet woodland. So we're planting species like alder and birch and willow, blackthorn, and a few others there. And we're joining up 2 of our bits of wet woodland at the Wood of Cree that had a gap of pasture before. So the final bit of work I'm going to talk about, sorry, that's an awful picture. I couldn't find any quick good ones of me engaging with anyone. So we love making the public aware of bird life and the plight of birds, so they can learn about them and maybe help us to help them, because we can't do it all by ourselves. So we run talks like this, we run guided walks, we put interpretation signs all over the place, and visit schools, do a whole load of stuff. And actually these pictures here are part of the Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership project that we've got going at Kenmure Homes. Thank you very much to you guys. So with a bit of funding, we were able to create a new track at Kenmure Homes into the willow tit habitat to allow visitors to get closer to them for a longer time when they're at the reserve and hear and learn about them and see them. We've also got some new interpretation panels up at the Kenmure Homes and Kendy Marshes, thanks to this project. So thankfully, people will know a little bit more when they step onto these sites. So all these things that we do don't work in isolation, they all feed into each other. It's vitally important that we get research done and survey work done to monitor populations. The research helps us understand what we need to do to the habitat to make it work for willow tits. And the monitoring works to tell us, oh, is that working or not? Do we need to tweak our habitat management a little bit? The nest box or nest site provision helps us monitor the birds as well, because we check them every year. You can see what's using them, what isn't. And then the public engagement is equally as important, because it gets people involved, gets people knowledgeable, and it helps us fundraise as well for this, you know, important work that we're doing. So if you want to know a bit more, take a little screenshot now. These are the other projects that are happening around the UK, and a couple of fact sheets about willow tits as well, if you're interested. And at the bottom one there is info about the National Willow Tit Survey that, although isn't happening officially this year, you can still input data. So thank you very much. That's all from me. Any questions I can take?
Thank you so much, Crystal. That was lovely. Yeah, we have 2 or 3 questions coming in. I suppose the first one relates straight away. I'll go to the last question, and this relates to everything the RSPB does in the area, not just on willow tits. But questioning from Paul Connor: any chance of joining up Kennedy, Marshes, the marshy area in the Three Castle, very similar looking habitat near the Osprey platform. And I guess this comes to volunteering opportunities as well. So people like Paul and others who are volunteering in the area and getting more volunteers to help you. Obviously, that's quite difficult under COVID, but COVID won't be with us forever. So, if you want to help out, how would you help out?
Yeah, you can help out in a few ways. I guess if you have a bit of suitable habitat near you in your garden that you have the ability to look after, put up a nest box for them, put out some feed for them. Maybe if you're going to get rid of some trees, double think, or maybe I could leave a high stump there, whereas before I would have felled the whole tree. Maybe I could make this a bit wetter, this corner of my garden a bit wetter for Willow Tit. Or if you want to volunteer for a local group that are managing a woodland, or a local organisation like the RSPB, just give them a ring. They're always willing to work with volunteers, and we do have guidelines in place at the moment to work safely with COVID, and I'm sure other organisations will have too.
And we also have to remember COVID won't be with us forever. So, there is light at the end of a tunnel, the dark tunnel as it's been.
Definitely.
Normality, hopefully.
I think, just to chip in, I think the gist of Paul's question, Paul Connor's question, and Lynn Stewart's question as well is about sort of maybe creating bits of habitat and joining up bits of Willow Tit habitat. So I think, the population in the Kennedy Valley is not doing too badly. So long as there aren't massive gaps between the sort of Willow Tit populations, I mean, you can envisage a nice chain of wet woodland all the way from Kennedy Marshes all the way down to Thrieve. And, if it's managed correctly and the Willow Tits continue to breed, there's no reason why they shouldn't move down there. I'm pretty sure there are Willow Tits around Thrieve. I'd need to check the detail of either go back to, and Lewis might know, either go back to the survey map that Crystal and I have already shown and check where Willow Tits have been heard and recorded. And similarly, yes, they have sort of popped over. We've got them around me in not far out of the village of Dalry, and I think you do get them on the other side of the main Casa Douglas road from Loch Ken. So they are around, and so if people are managing the habitat correctly, then they may well find their way there. It's just having that linkage, as Crystal says. They don't really like crossing open land to get to anywhere. They tend to follow hedges. So so long as there's a corridor, hopefully they would find their way to it.
It's worth noting that Galloway Glens is doing an awful lot of work down at Thrieve as well in a massive landscape restoration project, looking at the wetlands and how the habitats develop. And certainly National Trust of Scotland is very interested in ensuring that Willow Tit type habitat it doesn't decline, in fact has improved. So yeah, there's a number of people doing things, and I guess with a lot of wildlife, creating those linkages between different habitats is bound to help the species. Okay, we've got another question here from Larry, and it's more of a science centre. Larry Griffin, he's asking about the data. Is it showing a natural nest site availability? Is it limiting abundance in Dumfries and Galloway? I guess that comes down to the habitat manipulation and whether or not we keep our woods too tidy. Crystal, would you start off on that one? Maybe Andrew, you could come in.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked at recent papers studying if there's a cap on sorry, I can't get my sentence out. If it's impacting the numbers that can go in a woodland. but I imagine it would be quite a big factor. So if there's not enough old, I mean, that's one of the main things that we would manipulate in the woodland if we wanted to benefit willow tit is to create more natural nesting sites for them. So the age of your trees is very important. The type of tree and how quickly it rots is very important. So if you haven't got those vital components, old rotting holy trees dying in quick succession, so you've got a constant supply of them year on year, because willow tits need a fresh hole every year to excavate. So you need a constant supply of dying trees. If you haven't got that, then they can't nest. So obviously that's going to be a limiting factor. But I don't know fully, I don't know the details because I haven't read any recent studies on that.
And we were talking about habitat as well, then, Andrew, if you could maybe have a chat with Laura Keenan on the banks of a Nit in Dumfries. They're looking at doing some restoration of wet woodland. How big does your wet woodland need to be? There's an earlier comment in there that a territory of willow tit could be 5 to 8 hectares, but that doesn't necessarily that be the only willow tits in that territory, does it?
No, they may well overlap, but I mean, that's 5 to 8 hectares is a decent size woodland, so it doesn't need to be that size of woodland. But again, it will really depend on how many willow tits there might already be in that sort of area, and whether there's a connection to other small populations around there.
It'll be the quality of food in that woodland as well, and the quality of nest sites. So if it's got loads of nest sites and loads of food, you'll get more territories, and the opposite for the opposite.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the evening's drawing to an end at the moment, but I think one of the big things we can take out of this is that work has been done with this willow tit, but like so many species, which are perhaps a bit less fashionable, a bit less well known, Andrew rightly brought in there is actually a culture around willow tit, but often they are forgotten about these species whilst we talk about the iconic species all the time. It looks like we've got a species on the edge here, but it's doing okay in Galloway, and we should treasure that. And help the RSPB and others that are acting in this field to continue improving that habitat, and discourage maybe from tidying up our woods too much. So without much further, I'd maybe draw the meeting to a close. And what we traditionally do at the end of these meetings is everyone has an opportunity to unmute themselves and maybe give a round of applause to the presenters who, I know, put an awful lot of work in to get these presentations going. So thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you.